So today we have this beautiful 2006 Honda Element, and it has a leaking rack and pinion, so we are going to show you how to replace the rack and pinion. We're going to remove the rack and pinion and replace it with a remanufactured rack and pinion. You can remove your rack and pinion and rebuild it yourself if you want to. There are rebuild kits. But in this case, and then the procedure is the same for removal and installation. But in this case, we're going to do the more common thing, which is replace the rack and pinion. Okay, so we've got our rack and pinion here. We're trying to show you on camera, but it's pretty tight. So some of it we won't be able to show you till we have it removed from the vehicle. But our goal is to remove this rack and pinion, which what it consists of is, this looks a little different than most rack and pinions you may have seen. Most of them have the tie rods coming out. With this design, it doesn't use that. It has the tie rods mounted inside, and again, we'll show you when we get it out. But this entire assembly, it consists of the outer tie rod, the inner tie rod, the rack and pinion itself, and then it's attached with 4 bolts, 2 bolts on this side and 2 bolts on that side. That's what holds the main body to the vehicle. And then there's going to be a pressure hose and a return hose. And the pressure hose is when you turn your power steering, the power steering pump pressurizes the fluid and pumps it to the side of the rack and pinion that needs assist. So if you're turning it to the right, it'll pump the hydraulic fluid to the left and help you push the steering to the right. So that's how it works, or that's the components of it. And we're going to start by removing the tie rod, which there's a couple ways to remove this, but this tie rod boot is already broken, so we're not going to reuse this tie rod. So normally you would separate this and with the goal of keeping the tie rod in, but I'm not. I'm just going to take this nut off, pop it loose, and we're going to throw it away and replace it. So if you're trying to keep this, then you're going to want to be careful of the threads. You're not going to want to hit it with a hammer. You're going to want to use a tie rod separator or something so you can reuse that boot. So in this case, we're throwing it away. So we'll go ahead and start. We're going to go ahead and remove this tie rod, and then I'll go in and remove those 2 bolts. So these tie rods, this is how most all tie rods are. They're a press fit design. So once the nut's on there, the tapered shaft of the tie rod is stuck into this strut. So to get that out, you normally would use a pickle fork, which separates it, or you can use one of those tools where it's a mechanical tool where you screw a screw and pull the levers down on one side and open them on the other and pop it out. Or you can just use a hammer. You can whack it right here, and it's usually enough to vibrate it loose. And then some of these, like I said, we're not reusing this, so we don't care. We're going to smack it right here on the bottom, which you normally would not do because you'll mess the threads up and won't be able to reuse it anyway. So I'll give it one whack here on my bad side, my left side. When I say 1, I mean 5. That's not, so I just hit that. So now the outer tie rod is loose. And this is the inner tie rod in here, and it's connected to the body of the rack and pinion. So I'm not going to separate those. I'm going to take these bolts off, which are 17 millimeter, and remove this entire rack and pinion. There's also a return line that kind of comes down over here, and you can't see it because it's up in the frame area. There's a 10 millimeter hose clamp on it. So I'm going to remove that hose clamp. And again, you can't see it because it's this line that looks white, and it goes down and connects to a metal line right here. So we're going to disconnect that and pull it off. We just can't show you on camera. Okay, so we have the steering wheel disconnected from the rack and pinion. We've got the tie rods separated from the wheels. We have the bolts holding the rack and pinion assembly to the vehicle disconnected. I did leave them in there just to hold it in place. And now I'm going to disconnect the pressure hose, and this is the last thing really holding this together. So this pressure hose, there's a bracket here with a bolt, or this just pops right out. It's just a rubber thing that holds it there. So now that's out. Following this line down is where the pressure sensor is, and then it connects right to the power steering pump. So to get that off, they're just 10mm bolts. I'm going to clean this a little bit so we don't get anything in the pump. Okay, so now we're looking at this from the driver's side view. We've separated the tie rod. We took out the 2 bolts that hold the rack and pinion body to the vehicle. And now we're looking at it from this view because this is the angle where we're going to have to turn this rack and pinion so that this is the valve body up here of the rack and pinion. We have to turn this up and then weave it out of here. So I've got both lines disconnected, but I didn't disconnect them at the rack. I'm trying to do this with them connected, and I separated them from the other side. The power steering pressure hose I'm leaving connected, and I've got it disconnected at the top. I'm going to try and slide it out with everything connected. This is always the funnest part of these rack and pinions because it's a big piece and you got to squeeze it out of a small hole. I'm going to turn this. This strut also is going to be in my way, so I'm going to turn this, I guess, in all the way, like that. Try and keep it out of my way, and now I'm going to try and work this out. And if you're watching, I don't know how the video is going to come out, but I'm going to probably have to go up top. This is going to take a few minutes to maneuver in and out. So. Okay, so we have our old rack and pinion and we have our new remanufactured rack and pinion, and it comes unloaded. This rack and pinion comes unloaded, so it doesn't have tie rods, it doesn't have the bracket to bolt it to the vehicle, it doesn't have the pressure or the return lines, so we do have to swap some stuff over. We have a couple notes here. Honda Tech tip: due to the design of this power steering system, symptoms commonly attributed to rack failure may actually be caused by other components. For further information on this, refer to a vehicle service manual. Attention, carefully install hydraulic lines and torque fitting to original factory specs. Damaged threads void the warranty. Anytime you strip threads, you're going to void the warranty of any part because you're the one doing the stripping. So if something's not going to screw on properly, stop, rewind, and figure out why not and fix it. The tip about the rack and pinion not failing on its own, that's common. That's really common on a lot of parts out there. A rack and pinion uses hydraulic fluid to make it work. There is fluid, just like any other fluid. It does get contaminated over time. It heats up, it cools, it gets moisture, debris, dirt into the fluid, and that directly affects how these systems operate. So we're going to flush the fluid out, which is pretty normal anytime you put a new component like this on. You can also install a filter. Almost no car has a power steering fluid filter. We don't have one, or else we'd show it to you, but we might add one. We're doing this video today, so we don't have the filter to show you, but if you could install one, it's basically an inline filter that helps take out some of those contaminants. And if you change your fluid at the recommended intervals, you have a less chance of damaging the components. But anyway, so here's where we're at. We are ready to start swapping parts over. Now, this car is a 2006, so it's 12 years old. It's a Honda. You know, Hondas are great cars. They last a long time. This line here, which is partially metal and has these fitted rubber lines on them, this is the pressure hose, And it's the reason it's the pressure hose is because the pump is attached to this end, and when you turn your steering wheel, it pumps hydraulic fluid to the side, the opposite side you're steering from, to help you steer. Well, these lines, they'll get up to 2,000 plus PSI. Usually it says it on the line somewhere. And they fail from the inside out, kind of like a brake hose. So at this point, and because it came out really easy with the entire rack and pinion, you really don't pay any extra labor to put a new hose on. Because I'd have to take the old one off and put it on the new rack anyway. The way we do videos is, this is one of our employees' vehicles, and they're just paying costs for the hose, and there is no labor, because it's already, we don't charge them labor anyway, but there's no extra labor. So you're basically just paying for a pressure hose. So we have a brand new pressure hose here, and we're going to install that. We're going to make sure it's the right one. If you're at a shop and they're charging you additional labor to install a pressure hose when they're putting a rack and pinion in, on pretty much every vehicle, there should not be any extra labor. And you may want to consider, you know, if the shop hasn't recommended replacing it, then you may want to recommend it yourself, because no, it's not leaking. No, there's nothing visibly wrong with it at this moment in time. But it's 12 years old. It's got, how many miles are on your car? 100,000 miles on it. There's no labor. This hose, I think it was like 30 bucks our cost, so we're not marking it up. He just pays for the part at our discount, and you know, it's kind of a no-brainer. You know, do you want to put the old one back on the new rack, and then 6 months later, a year later, it leaks and you got to go in and replace it? You're going to pay labor on top of the hose and on top of fluid, and potentially damage a new rack and pinion. So new rack and pinion, we're putting a new pressure hose on. We also have a new return hose. Now these are molded to fit perfectly, so you'll want to, you know, match the ends and everything, but you're not just going to get a bulk rubber line to fit properly, because it's going to bend and kink. You need these molded hoses. So another hose that's not that expensive, and there's no labor because we've got to transfer the old one to the new one. So anyway, so we've got to we're going to install 2 new lines. The pressure hose does have a pressure sensor built in, or I'm sorry, that screws into it. And we were originally going to just reuse the old one, but it is not coming off. It is stuck on there. We're at the point now of getting it off, and I've got to use extra force, so we've ordered a switch. We won't have it until tomorrow, unfortunately. So I'm going to take this hose off and try to save the old one, and if we get a new switch, we may not be able to get that on video because we're doing the video today, but anyway, we should have ordered this switch ahead of time, and really, as a technician, I'd like to put a new switch on. I don't want to have to do this job again. And if the customer can afford it and agrees, then you should just replace the switch. So we'll see how that goes. But we also got new inner tie rod ends and outer tie rod ends. So the outer tie rod ends are not well, the boots are ripped. The rubber boots are ripped. We showed you that earlier. When we removed them, we didn't care about them because we're going to replace them. So we got new outer tie rods, we got new inner tie rods, and we're going to go ahead and install it on this new rack and show you how to do it. Okay, so I'm looking at the return hose, which is just working from the top of the rack down. The return hose has a clamp on it here, attaching it to the valve body. This is the valve body of the rack and pinion, and then the pressure hose is below it. So that's looks like a 10 millimeter. Now I really wouldn't have to remove this, except I'm going to try and save this pressure switch. So I'm going to remove both of these lines, and there's a bracket here that needs to be transferred over. So I'm going to remove it just as you would if you were replacing each part. Okay, and then I'm going to loosen these bracket bolts before I take that nut off. Actually, I'll loosen the nut, then take the bracket bolts off, and that's probably a 12 millimeter, and I'll use a line wrench. Okay, so we have the pressure line we're trying to remove off the old rack. Even though we have a new one to put on the new rack, I'm trying to take this line off so that I can get this line over to a bench so I can try and get this pressure sensor off. I'm only doing this to try and save the pressure sensor, that's it, which it's barely looks savable as it is. So, of course, the nut holding the pressure line is already rounded off, so no socket fits on there perfectly. So I had to get, it's a 13 millimeter socket, which a 13 millimeter line wrench should fit on there perfectly, but it doesn't. So I went to a standard size 1/2 inch, which is slightly smaller, and then I basically got it on the edges and I hammered it onto the nut. Because it was so rounded, once I got it hammered on, I tapped it a couple times and it got the nut loose. So that's just a little mechanical thing. Sometimes you got to do that kind of stuff because that's how it works. So now that's another reason why we wouldn't want to reuse this pressure line. You're never going to get it torqued properly without the proper wrench on it. And why leave it? Then you're trying to get it off another time. Just get rid of it and put a new one on. So keep your bolts in order because they're different lengths. Some have washers, some don't. So keep them in order of the way they came off. It's just less confusing later. And there's the return line with the bracket and the clamps. So I'll lay that over there. Get this out of the way so I don't damage it. This little heat shield, oh, they did give me, okay, great. Sometimes these don't come with it, and it did come on the new one, so that's great news. So, all right, now we're gonna go to the bench, put this in a vise, and hopefully remove this sensor. They always make these sensors just thin enough for most cheap wrenches to fit into. You normally need a nice wrench. You put this in a vise, hold it, put a nice wrench at the bottom, and that's all you usually need to get it off. We had to get this away from the rack and pinion to be able to put this in a vise. So we're going to run to the vise, do that, and come back. Okay, I screwed the new sensor into the new line. Now I'm going to swap over these clamps, which just hold this to that base. You just bend them and pull them off, and then this should come off. Well, maybe it doesn't. Okay, these rubbers don't come off, so I can either cut them off or I'll just use tie straps. Now this is, when you buy aftermarket parts, this is kind of some of the stuff you run into. It's not going to be absolutely identical to the Honda part, but this is the trade-off. You know, if you're going to buy a factory original Honda part, you're going to pay more for it. But it'll be the exact part that came off the car. In this case, we got a much cheaper hose. It doesn't have these rubber fittings, which, you know, you could argue these prevent failure by preventing the hose from rattling, which is probably true. But to cut these things off and then hope they're good enough to reinstall, plus they're like super hard. They're barely rubber anymore. So anyway, it's really just meant to hold it in place. The pressure line does vibrate because it has pressure in it, and you're forcing pressure, you know, into the rack and pinion. So it will vibrate a little bit. So I'll just have to make sure I have it nice and secure a different way. Okay, so we're putting this on camera because this is our rigged up job to get this inner tie rod end off. Now I am using the standard inner tie rod tool, which is a socket that usually goes down the inner tie rod and hooks onto another socket that's cut. It's kind of like a, it's got one side cut out like a crow's foot, and it fits over top of the joint. So I can't, this Honda Element uses very long inner tie rod ends, so this tool will not work. So I'm using just the socket, and I got a big wrench on it. We also don't have a vise big enough to hold this entire rack and pinion, so I'm using the car to hold it down. Now hopefully I'll get this loose. And it's trying to turn. Let me lower it a little bit more. Okay, that's one side off. Time to get the other side. Now I can actually, I got too much tension. I'll have to flip that around. The way these this is supposed to be bent. This washer fits over that square hex there. And then once this is tight, you bend the tabs over so that this whole thing can't spin. So it's a little safety lock there, and the new ones come with these. So, and you do have to be careful when you do this, because this rack and pinion, the one we ordered, is remanufactured. We have to send this back as a core. The core is like $100 or 150 bucks or something. So they got to rebuild this one so they can sell it to somebody else. Well, if I put too much force on this rack and pinion, I could break it or crack the case, and then I wouldn't get my core value back. So you do want to keep, this in mind. And the only reason we pulled those tie rods off is so we could get this off, which this is where the two inner tie rods mount to the rack and pinion. It doesn't come on the new rack. It'd be nice if it did. But anyway, so we need to pop these off and pop this off and install it on the new rack. Once I final torque this, I'll tap this washer down to lock it in place. Okay, so this is the old tie rod. This is the outer tie rod end, and this is the inner tie rod end. The inner tie rod end goes all the way into here, and this is where the actual joint is, right here. So when you steer, this is what moves some, and this moves some. So when we're installing a brand new inner tie rod and a brand new outer tie rod, this is where the toe adjustment is set. So on the front of the vehicle, you have three angles. You have camber, you have caster, you have toe. Toe is the last angle set, and it's really the most important for tire wear, or it's really, they're all very important, but toe is what keeps your steering wheel straight and what keeps the wheels pointed straight. So there's three angles. The camber is if these are your tires, the top, how far the top of the tire leans in and out is camber. How forward or backward one tire is caster, and then which way they point is the toe. So we're installing brand new, and you have to do an alignment after you put any kind of front end parts on, because you're going to change the toe. Even a quarter turn of this changes the toe. So before I just take this apart, or before I just randomly screw the new one together, I want to know where the old one was so that I can set the brand new one to the same exact place, so that when it goes to the alignment shop, it's not way off. This is another part that will save labor, because if you do a bunch of front end work on your car and then you take it to the shop and the alignment is way out, it may take them an hour or two to get it aligned, and they could rightfully charge you extra labor because they have to sit there and readjust everything back to where it was before you messed with it. So you should do this for them. It'll save you a headache and time and maybe money. So what we're going to do is count the threads and then measure the threads. The reason we're measuring the threads is because in the old days you could count threads and be pretty much the same, but what if this old inner tie rod has a different number of threads than the new inner tie rod? Remember, we're using aftermarket parts. So aftermarket parts are never exactly the same, and occasionally you'll get one with a different thread count. So if I just counted these threads and said, oh, there's 8 threads on the inside, well, unless I measure it and make sure it's the exact same distance, then I'm not sure of that. So what I'm going to do is count the threads on the inside of the nut, take it off, count the threads on the outside, how far in the tie rod is screwed in, and I'm going to do a total measurement and see if it's the same. And that way it'll be simple. I can put the new nut on to the same exact length of space that I need, and then I can screw the new outer tie rod on, and it'll be exactly the same, or pretty close to exactly the same as it was beforehand. So then when they go to align it, this nut is what they loosen to do the alignment on. So if you so if I loosen this now, okay, so now I can back this. Now I don't want to loosen it too much because I'm going to mess the threads up. And also you can tell by the dirt. That's another easy way. So I got the nut loose, and now I'm getting old, so I can't count threads anymore, so I got to use a flathead screwdriver. So I just do it like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I've got 6 threads till the inside of the lock nut. Then I'll take this the rest of the way off. I'll measure it, or I'll count them, and then I'm going to do a total measurement from how far away. This outer tie rod I have not moved yet. So I want to do a measurement and make sure it's exactly the same as the old one. So I'll do that and put the new one on, and then we can proceed putting the car back together. These are color coded because red is the pressure hose and black is the return hose. Okay, so we've transferred everything over. We've got new inner and outer tie rods. We have the return line, we got the pressure line. The return line did not match up exactly, so we're missing a loop here and the bracket that goes here. However, it's secured good enough in my view. It is the return line. It vibrates a little bit, but it doesn't have any kind of pressure like the pressure line does. That's why this pressure side, it's steel here, and then the part that needs to bend is rubber. But the only tricky part here would be if you want to replace these. So these rubber pieces on the hoses, they're really not easy to remove. It'll look like that. They're not meant to come off. So you can still get them off though. I just take a blade or a saw and just slice a slit in it, and then you can just peel it right off. And that way you can install it back on. Now I do want to see where it is on this return hose. So it's about right there. And that was for this clamp, sorry. Yeah, this clamp, I believe. And I didn't pay attention to which way it came off, so luckily I'm videoing. I can rewind the video and see. But this goes around it like this, clamps back down, and that way I can reuse that. So it goes about right there. When I go and put it up top the car, I can finalize the position, but that's transferred now. Okay, so we have the rack slid back in. I just have these 2 bolts screwed in, a couple 5 or 6 threads. I want to leave them loose because I have to connect the steering wheel, the steering column, to the top of the rack and pinion. So the rack and pinion or steering gear just has a shaft, which it's hard hopefully we got it earlier on the video. It's a shaft that connects to the rack and pinion. Your steering wheel mechanically connects directly to the rack and pinion. So one thing I did not do, and I don't remember if I mentioned it or not, but you're supposed to, on these cars, disable the airbag clock spring, or in other words, you're supposed to remove the steering wheel. I didn't do that on this car, so when I pull the steering shaft off, I had this side loose, so hopefully I don't mess with the clock spring. You can damage the clock spring on these cars, at a lot of cars, so you have to take the airbag out, then take the clock spring out, the airbag out, then the steering wheel out. I skipped that part. Technically by the book you should do that unless you're going to risk breaking the clock spring. Now the way I'm going to put this back together, I'm going to try and not turn the steering wheel or lift it up, and I'm trying to lift it back on to the shaft without messing with the steering wheel. So we won't know if I messed it up till we're done, and if I get an airbag light or if the horn doesn't work. Those are two big signals that the airbag clock spring has been broken. So okay, so we have our pressure line coming up from underneath. We're going to attach it to the rack and to the power steering pump. I am putting a new O-ring on. It did come with it. I'm going to dip it in the fluid, the oil. Anytime you put O-rings on, whether it's power steering, air conditioning, you want to lubricate the O-ring just so you don't tear it when you slide it into place. So this one I'll pop on like that. Make sure there's a good layer of oil running around it. That way when you push it into spot, it doesn't tear the O-ring. So this just pushes right in. The new O-ring will make it a little more difficult than the old one because it's a brand new O-ring. So now it's in there. Put our two bolts in. Yes, this has a torque spec. Every bolt pretty much has some type of torque spec. I did not look up the torque spec. I will look it up before we are done. We did get a little bit of power steering fluid on the belt. I can see it, so I do want to clean that off with, I'm going to use an alcohol-based cleaner to get that oil off of there. Probably won't hurt anything, but it's possible the belt could slip, possibly. And then you should take a rag and wipe the oil off because it'll. So anyway, okay, we're done up here. We do want to put this into place. This is really, again, it's not X-Acto fit, so it's close. I'll probably put a couple tie straps on that to hold it in place. I'm going to make sure the rack is all good. I do have to plug in the pressure switch, and I routed the switch up high so that it wouldn't get caught. I got to unroute it and find the side that snaps, which is there. And snap it on. And there it goes. Okay. And I still have to tighten the pressure line. So I just wanted to get it where it's going to be, which is going to be about right there. And now I can finish tightening. Here's the pressure line. That was a 14 millimeter. Now I'm going to bring a little tiny wrench in there and snug that down the rest of the way. Okay, so next we're going to fill the power steering fluid up. We still have to attach the tie rods, and I did straighten the steering wheel and connect the steering shaft to the rack and pinion steering gear. But now I'm going to fill it up with fluid, and we want to get rid of all the old fluid. We got rid of probably 80% of it, but there's still some in the pump. So what happens is once we turn the engine back on and the pump fires up, there's a couple ways to bleed this, but I'm going to use the fluid that's in it. I'm going to leave the return line empty, and I'm going to pump the rest of the fluid out through the return line. And all I got to do is make sure the reservoir stays full, and I won't run the pump dry. You don't ever want to run the pump dry. As far as fluid goes, this is a Honda. It takes its own special power steering fluid. In the old days, power steering fluid was all the same. It was mostly 10-weight motor oil is mostly what it is. But now the cars have gotten a little more complex, and each company has added their own little recipe to the power steering fluid. to try and keep it as a lubricant, to try and keep it clean, to try and put detergents in there, and to keep heat and moisture and all these different things. So anyway, we got Honda power steering fluid that we're going to fill this reservoir up with. I'm going over the max because I know I'm going to flush this. Next, we're going to hook the tie rods up. I got to put the boot on and the nut, and then I've got to worry about straightening the steering wheel. There's two ways to do it. You could do it at the very end with the steering wheel off. It's easy, which I didn't do that step because that requires removing the airbag. Not that that's not a major. That's definitely doable, and you shouldn't be like super scared of it. Just read and research how to do it, and it's not that big of a deal. But I chose to skip it and try and save time. I might have cost time, but we'll see. So I'm going to do it the opposite way. I counted the threads to the tie rods. I centered the steering wheel. Well, that's where I messed up. The rack and pinion was not centered. So I might have to separate the steering wheel again. I mean the inner steering shaft again, but because the rack and pinion would have to be centered first. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, now we're pretty much done. I'm going to leave this. This is the return line. I'm leaning it loose because I want to get the fluid out of the power steering pump. Most of it drained out of the other side of it drained out through the return line. Now I just got to get the pressure side cleared out. All right, so we have the rack and pinion installed. We got the wheels back on, the fluid's on, it's flushed, it's drained. The job is mostly done. Now we're gonna clean up the wheel alignment before we take it for a wheel alignment. So you can actually do an at-home wheel alignment. It's only a partial. You're only really adjusting the toe. I mean, you can get crazier, but for this, we just want to make sure the tires are pointed straight and that it's pretty much lined up with a straight steering wheel. So I still have the steering wheel disconnected from the steering shaft. I've centered the front wheels to where they're pointing towards the front. Now before I attach the steering wheel, what I'm going to actually do is, this is not for the steering wheel, but this is for the toe. So what you do is I take a red marker and I put a red X on the back of this tire and on the back of this tire. And I'm going to use a tape measure and I'm going to measure the exact distance to the centimeter or even, you know, the exact distance while the tires are pointed in this direction. Then I'm going to spin the tires all the way around to where my red mark is in the front. Now what that's done is my toe, remember the toe is which way the tires point. So it's kind of like your steering wheel. But if you turn, you want both your tires pointing straight ahead or pointing where you're going to turn. So if you have two tires pointed out like this, that's no good. You're going to get tire wear. It's bad for the vehicle. So all this does is make sure that the front of the tires meets the back of the tires. So if my tires are pointed like this, now this is exaggerated, and imagine this is the inside of my tires and my red mark, I would measure it. Then when I spun the tires around to the front, the red mark is in the front, I'd have a wider measurement because my tires are not dead straight. Now the only reason you have to do this is because we separated the tie rods and put new tie rod ends on. So I did dial the tie rods back as many threads as I counted, so they should be pretty close. And I might not have to do any adjustment at all. But if my tires are like that, then on this car, the tie rods are in the back of the wheel. So you just think about it. I need the backs of the wheel to go out So I would undo that lock nut, spin the tie rod so that the tie rod unscrews out, and then tighten it back down. So I'm going to do a quick measurement, see how far or how close or how far away it is. Okay, so we're going to do our final inspection here. The rack and pinion's done. We bled it. We checked all the connections, checked all the fittings, grease fittings, all that kind of stuff. We are now, we set the toe with our basic little homemade, little way of doing that. We're still taking it to the alignment shop to get dialed in exactly. We centered the steering, well, we centered both front wheels. We measured for the back of the tires, spun them to the front, made sure that the toe was very close, and it was. Now we have centered both front wheels, and we've centered the steering wheel by eye and reconnected the steering shaft, and so we're pretty much straight ahead. One thing you got to make sure is you can spin it the same number of times to the left as you can to the right. So this is Honda straight up. 1 1.5, yeah, 1 3/4. Go back to the center. 1 1.5 3/4. Okay, so we're basically in the middle. That means we put the rack and pinion in the middle. So basically, you could actually have 3 turns to one side and a half turn to the other side if you don't center the rack properly. So anyway, this job is not that hard. It's probably a 6 on a 5 or 6 on like a 1 to 10 scale. You'd want to research and make sure you read an owner's manual or a repair manual if you're going to do it yourself. This video, we made it to help you so you can do it yourself. So please give it a like and please subscribe, and we'll make a lot of more videos. The more likes and subscribes we get, the more we know you watch it and you care. And please comment, ask questions. I know we edit stuff out and move it around, and sometimes it gets confusing. So, and sometimes we don't show stuff. So we try to show everything we can, but so give us a like please and a subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.